All right, folks, welcome back to the Bookstore Live interviews. Very excited to have Brad Kammer here. Brad, welcome.
Thanks, Guy. Happy to be
Okay.
here.
Yeah. So let me read your bio, and then we're going to talk about your book, The Practical Guide for Healing Developmental Trauma. So Brad is a licensed California marriage and family therapist and professional clinical counselor. He's trained as a somatic psychotherapist and has worked in the field of trauma for over 20 years, specializing in working with adverse childhood experiences, as well as complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Brad began his career as a humanitarian aid worker in Asia, which introduced him to personal and collective trauma. He's now the director of the Complex Trauma Training Center that provides training, consultation, and community for mental health professionals working with complex trauma. Brad is the co-author of the book, The Practical Guide for Healing Developmental Trauma, which we're going to be talking about today. So did I miss anything in the bio you want to touch base on?
No, that's great.
Okay.
Perfect.
So who's this book for? Give us some indication of why you wrote the book, what the book's about, all that stuff.
Okay. Yeah. Well, the history would probably be a good place to start. So my teacher, mentor, and partner for the last 10 or 15 years is Dr. Lawrence Heller, who developed the NeuroAffective relational model, which we call NARM. And in 2012, him and Aline Lapierre wrote the book called Healing Developmental Trauma, which has been a really great selling book within the field of trauma. And it introduced the NARM model there. And it basically, as soon as it came out, people started requesting more understanding about it. It was, a lot of theory in the book and kind of providing the framework, but a little weaker maybe on the clinical or the skill focused. And so people were saying, okay, great. We this really resonates. And what do we do with it? How can we bring this into our own lives? How can we bring it to our clients, people that we work with? And so that started the writing of the follow-up book called The Practical Guide for Healing Developmental Trauma. That's really specifically focused for breaking down the skills that are part of this framework of NARM. And initially, when we set out to write it, it was really focused on clinicians and mental health professionals. But as we started writing it, it really started to open up, and we saw the usefulness for not just therapists, but also all sorts of helping professionals. And then we even took it a little farther and thought, well, you know what, just general public people really appreciated that first book, and they're going to get a lot out of this too. So we started developing exercises in the book that not only could be applied to working with clients if you work with them, but also to yourself if you're wanting to exploring some of these patterns and skills within yourself. So that's really where the formulation of the book came from.
Okay. So who's it for?
Well, I mean, the primary target market would be people that are interested in working with complex trauma or are working already with complex trauma. And, there's all sorts of different trainings and models out there. And, it's a big commitment, both time-wise, financial-wise, to go and get trained in all these different models. So we were trying to really create greater accessibility so that people could take some of this understanding and, again, bring it into the work they're doing or into their own lives. And, of course, if it does interest them to go further in training, we provide trainings, and there's other models out there that provide trainings as well. But really, it's just a standalone book that you don't even have to read the first book, although we do recommend it. But it's really a standalone book to help understand how this framework can be useful in this emerging field of complex trauma.
Okay. So give, people are listening to this, and a lot of therapists, mental health providers of all kinds. Give us the sketch of what we're talking about here specifically, NARM specifically.
Yeah. Well, the NeuroAffective relational model, again, was created by Dr. Lawrence Heller. And, one of the things that a lot of the folks over the last 30 years or so, since they've been really a greater understanding of trauma, is that there's many different forms of trauma. And so if we really wanted to kind of make it very simplistic, there's kind of two broad categories. One is where the PTSD diagnosis captures, which sometimes we call event traumas or shock traumas. These are really captured by that diagnosis that most people are now familiar with, PTSD. But we've really started to understand, again, over the last 30 years or so, that there's another whole category of trauma, which Dr. Judith Herman coined complex trauma. And just 5 years ago became officially recognized through the ICD, the World Health Organization, as a standalone diagnosis, CPTSD, even though it hasn't yet been approved in North America. And so there's a lot of overlap. Most of our clients, those of us that are mental health professionals, most of our clients have both shock and complex trauma or shock and developmental trauma, cultural trauma, intergenerational trauma. But NARM is really specifically designed for working with these elements of CPTSD.
Okay. And specifically, what is someone going to learn through this book? How is it going to help them?
Yeah, we have the first couple chapters will give a basic overview of the field of complex trauma and the principles, the kind of theoretical principles of the NeuroAffective relational model. And then from chapter 3 through the rest of the book, we are focusing on different skills within the framework. So chapters 3, 4, 5, and 6 are what we call the 4 NARM pillars. So those are kind of the 4 main skills that we bring when we work with clients. And again, we've written it in a way that can also be expanded beyond just psychotherapy and even for our own personal practice. And then we have a few more aspects of the clinical model in chapters 7, 8, and 9. And then in chapters 10 and 11, we have case studies. So we have actually like a transcript of one is Dr. Heller working with a client, and one is me working with a client.
Oh, cool.
And then we kind of reference the different skills that we've introduced earlier in the book by breaking down the session. So on one side of the page is actually the transcript. The other side of the page, is us breaking it down.
So you mentioned 3 pillars of NARM. Can you share 4 pillars? What are those?
So the first is what we often refer to as clarifying the therapeutic contract, which that word contract sounds a little bit formal, but it's really about setting an intention. The client has to set the intention of what it is that they want out of the therapy session. And a really big component of this for complex trauma is about consent. That relational consent is so critical when working, particularly with people that have had relational trauma or complex trauma. So that's a big part. We don't move forward and start processing in therapy until we really have this consent online. And it helps the therapist also be very clear about where our interventions will be focused, because it's going to be emerging from what the client most wants for themselves. So that's pillar 1, setting intention. It's beyond setting intentions beyond psychotherapy. You find that in prayer, you find that in ritual, you find that in so many different aspects of people's life. And when we don't feel like we have a lot of agency in our life, we just kind of go with things and don't really set intentions for ourselves and try to develop, move in future direction for ourselves in a positive, supportive way. So there's a whole art to pillar number 1. It looks really easy on paper, and
I'm thinking to myself, it does.
Yeah.
But I love it. And I mean, so much of what you say and what you talk about, I love it. I want to get in there, but I know we don't have too much time, but just briefly. So setting intention, it's not just for the therapists.
Exactly.
This is also to allow the client to have some agency in what the heck is going on.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about, most of our clients didn't grow up in environments, particularly their early childhood, where there was a lot of interest in who they were or seeing them for who they were. So they never really were able to internalize, like, what is it that I want to do? Who am I? And how do I find this authentic? We talk about this authentic self. How do we actually find that? And it starts from the very beginning in the NARM approach by inviting them to start to reflect on that. Now, again, I said it's not easy in real life, because clients, the number 1 answer on the board is, I don't know. That's what a client will say when you ask that. And, when people come into our trainings, they start to, get really stressed out in our first weekend together, because they start practicing it. And then their clients are all saying, I don't know. And there really is an art form to how do we stay present with someone that allows them to connect to really what's motivating them, to be in a therapist's office at 2 p.m. We take that for granted, but there's something deeper even than just symptom reduction that they're wanting for themselves. And
Right.
so
Love that. Yeah.
we explore that as part of pillar 1. Pillar 2 is NARM is an inquiry-based model, which means that it's driven by our curiosity. So many of our interventions in NARM are really going to be shaped through questions that we ask. And there's a lot of different philosophy behind this, but it's similar to what I was just saying, that children weren't growing up often in environments. There was a lot of curiosity. And so learning to self-reference, learning to kind of get to know what's happening inside of ourselves is something, at least in our society, that is not often supported. It's actually quite the opposite. We're designed and supported to kind of be very externally driven. And so as people start to learn greater self-inquiry, they start to connect to some of these patterns inside themselves that actually aren't working for them anymore, that are just automatic and have been pretty unconscious. So inquiry, there's different forms of how we bring curiosity, but that's the second pillar of NARM.
Okay. Just briefly, I want to pause here for a second. So give me an example of what that might look like in practice.
So there's two different kinds of directions we go on with curiosity. One is what we call deconstruction of experience. So let's say through pillar 1, someone says that they want to feel greater peace in their life. They're yelling at their kids all the time. They're getting in fights with their family and their friends, and they're having trouble at work. They just want to experience greater peace in their life. So what we would do maybe as part of the inquiry process is we would ask them a question. For example, is there a specific area of your life where you're noticing that you're really having difficulty bringing peace more into your life? Oh yeah, with my kids, I'm just always I'm yelling at them all the time. And so then we would start to deconstruct the different elements of that experience, because often, again, it's very automatic, and they're not connected to all of the different kind of aspects of that experience that often aren't even related to the present moment. Like I like to say in the trainings, like when couples fight about the dishes, they're not really fighting about the dishes.
Right.
Exactly. It's what we bring in and project onto that experience. And so that's where we start to go with deconstructing this experience. So if they got up in a fight about the dishes or they yelled at their kids, we start to really help them get a little bit more deeper underneath the behavior or the symptom into these, what we call these psychobiological patterns that we have developed through early childhood, particularly, and that are still really running our lives in many ways, that are creating a lot of problems for us.
Cool. Okay. So that's first two pillars.
Yep. Third pillar was the hardest to write about in the book. And when people come through our trainings, they say this is what generally stands apart from many other clinical models that people have learned. It's what we call reinforcing agency. Self-agency is it's usually referred to in the literature. And, one of the things about early trauma is that we lose development of agency. Everything feels like it's always happening to us. And, we move into adulthood, we move into adolescence, and then to adulthood. And we don't feel like we're subjects in the world. We feel like we're objects, and things are always happening to us. And even when there is very little possibility of making change externally, which for many people, that's true. They can't change the systems they're living in. They can't change the families or the relationships or their work. There is always ways that we can start to be in more supportive relationship with what's happening internally. So the two words I talk about with agency is the way that people organize their internal world and the way that we relate to our internal world. And that's, again, very automatic for people. They're not aware of how they're organizing themselves and how they're relating to themselves. So a very quick example is someone gets a text. Well, actually, this is a better example. Someone's walking down the hall at work, and they say hi to someone, and that person is walking past them and doesn't say hi. So immediately they're like, no one likes me, and, this always happens to me, or they get really mad at the person, and they have a very specific response based on this external experience. And then later on, they find out that that person was running to the bathroom because they just got a text that someone had passed away in their family. So they weren't even oblivious to that person, that they didn't say, they didn't even hear the person or see the person. So it had nothing to do with that person personally, but that person created this whole reality and had all these reactions based on this experience. So it's not about the external situation in that moment. It's about how they organize themselves and related to that really caused them a lot of suffering and pain. And with trauma, that's really strong. We bring that into our adulthood. We are projecting into our present life experiences that happened to us in the past that are creating a lot of suffering for us. So again, we can't change a lot of external factors, but we can get to know more about how we're relating to them.
Wow. Awesome. You have an incredible ability to articulate these concepts that are oftentimes elusive, really important, not always talked about, but crucial for therapists, and especially therapists working with trauma.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. Well, it's my passion. We've talked several times about it. Guy, can I finish off with the fourth pillar?
Yes, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, great.
I want to say that.
I want to get that done because I know we don't have a lot of time. Fourth pillar is what I often joke is the Shavasana phase of NARM, which for those people that have practiced yoga know that it's kind of the integrative phase of yoga. Like after you've done your practice, you lie down and you kind of take some time to integrate. One of the things that happens very quickly is when people start to experience these shifts internally, they disconnect from them. Whether it's a cognitive insight, whether it's an emotional settling, whether it's something somatically that happens, people shift in different ways very quickly away from it. Often they're shifting as in forms of self-attack. Like a good example is a client will have this really nice shift happening in therapy, and then quickly they'll say something like, oh, but I had to pay a therapist to get here, or it's taken me 50 years to learn this. It's like they immediately take what they just experienced new and they use it to then attack themselves. That's a very common example that happens. And so we work with these patterns of what we call connection and disconnection, and helping people build greater capacity to stay in connected states and get to know the ways that they might start to disconnect, so that when they go out into their life, they have more organization, they have more capacity in their daily lives.
Awesome. All right. Remind our listeners the title of the book.
It is The Practical Guide for Healing Developmental Trauma. So there it is. And it's now also out in German. It's getting translated in Japanese and a few other languages. So and of course you can find it on Amazon and Audible. It's on audiobook as well, that Dr. Heller both recorded it together, which was really a challenging but fun experience. So
Awesome. All right. And I just want to mention briefly, you just started a new training center, the Complex Trauma Training Center, or CTTC.
Yes.
We'll have that linked up here also. Brad, awesome, man. Really love talking to you. Appreciate you coming on here today.
Yeah, I always, I love the work you're doing, guys. So thank you so much for continuing to invite me, and look forward to us collaborating moving forward.
All right. Appreciate you, brother. Take care.
You too. Thanks.